We have a shelter called Trinity Place for homeless queer youth, and in June it'll have been opened 6 years without ever closing for a night. But I'd like to share a little bit of how it started, how it's connected to particularly our work with undocumented immigrants, but our multicultural work. Well, it was a writer, a journalist, who planted the seed for this shelter about 8 years ago. On Pride Sunday, there was an essay in the New York Times called "No Pride Here" by a gay writer who was challenging the wealthier gay community in New York City and saying, well, there's this big parade, there's pride, but what about these young people in the shadows? Where's pride for them? And he wrote a really in-depth essay with a lot of interviews. And the thing about it that was shocking to me, and I read it that Sunday morning before church, was that it stated that in all of New York City there were 12 beds specifically dedicated to this population. And I was just like, in New York City there are 12 beds? I mean, I was just shocked. And I prepare a manuscript to preach from. I don't allow the Spirit to direct me away from the manuscript. But on this Sunday, I had already prepared my manuscript, and I just felt I had to talk about this, and that kind of planted a seed among other people who just nobody was aware that this was such a huge issue, and that there was such a paltry amount of resources. But our church was very small, had a huge deficit, and there was just a sense, well, this is terrible, but we can't do anything. But it still was something we thought about. And then the Empire State Pride organization called a meeting, and that was not to kind of challenge the gay community, but to challenge churches, synagogues, mosques, and say, you've caused a lot of this problem, what are you going to do about it? And so that seemed like, okay, but let's go and talk with other people and like, what more can we do? Like, we can't do anything on our own, but what can we do together? So I went with Jeremy Posadas, and it was one of the most discouraging meetings either of us have ever sat through, because people from various agencies got up and talked about their work, which we were pretty much aware of already, but they presented the problem, which we were aware of, but they did what you should never do, which is present a very compelling case of a need, but not provide any way for people to engage it. And the only suggestions of what to do were send checks to these organizations. And then one group also said you could, send toilet paper. And Jeremy and I were like, well, okay, we could have a special offering, or, we could have a fundraiser, but that just didn't seem, we wanted to somehow do more. Well, sure, we can collect toilet paper, but it just wasn't, and I don't want to dismiss that, because we have groups that collect toiletries for our shelter, and that makes a big difference. But it left us feeling really deflated. And there was no interchange among the people there of what we might do together. It was mostly, okay, these are what these groups are doing, but the problem's so much bigger, but we don't even have enough money for it. And we're thinking, here's organizations bigger than us, and they don't have enough money, how can we do it? And then a few months later, we got an email from the same group saying that, winter was coming, and in the coldest months of the winter, they were asking for religious institutions to open their doors all night for, a week of nights, and host 7 young people. And the cots would be provided, and basically the church would provide dinner and breakfast and someone to be there overnight. So that just seemed like, well, of course we could do that. I mean, it just seemed like an entry into something. And our intern that year was Chris Wogeman. So he volunteered to organize that project as his internship project. As he was organizing it, found so many people that wanted to be involved that instead of doing it for 1 week, we did it for 3 weeks. And it went really, really well, and it made people want to do more, but there was still the issue of we being very small and we not having the resources. Oh, and the other thing that was rather tragic was in the whole city, there were only 2 other groups that agreed to do this. And, I mean, how many churches and synagogues are vacant at night? I mean, the majority are vacant. I mean, there are other places that have shelters, most are vacant at night. And then two women who had been part of organizing this project, not from our church, came to us because it had gone so well and said, we have money to support this for a year if you would, do it full-time for a year. And so then we entered into, conversations at the church about really doing this seriously.